Good evening, everyone. It's a couple minutes after, so we're going to go ahead and start tonight's webinar. I'm Tracy Carluccio. I'm Deputy Director of Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And we're going to be hearing tonight from Kacy Manahan, Senior Attorney for Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and myself. But first, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping and logistics for our webinar, Caverns, what you need to know about New Jersey's proposed underground storage cavern rules. So we have a PowerPoint presentation tonight, and then we will open it up after that for questions. And we are recording this tonight, and each registrant for the webinar, whether or not they were able to attend, will get a link to the recording. And we will also be including suggested talking points that we're going to be putting into the chat and helpful links about the proposed rulemaking. Please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know who you are and where you're from. We do plan to end right at 8 p.m. to honor your time, or before that, but certainly not going after 8 p.m. We'll be, when we put some helpful links into the chat as we go along, we would also like you to put your questions into the Q&A box. That Q&A box then we'll be looking at in order to be able to answer your written questions. If we don't know the answer, we'll get back to you. We're going to have a follow-up email go out afterwards. So we're going to go ahead and start the slideshow now. And first, would like to say that, as you can see, we have our disclaimer here. The second slide is our disclaimer. Just want to get everything straight and legal, that the information being provided in the PowerPoint and during the webinar does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice, and all information, content, and materials are for general information purposes only. Please contact your attorney to obtain advice with respect to any particular legal matter. Thank you. So on our next slide, we're going to give just a little bit of context here. And the reason for this is because this is not a very well understood or thought about issue. And that's why we call this Caverns, Wet Caverns. The proposed rulemaking will cover manufactured caverns and, quote, systems that are used for the underground storage of any natural or artificial gas or any petroleum product or derivative of any petroleum product, with the exception of liquefied natural gas, which they are proposing to prohibit from cavern storage. And I'm going to go over the couple of places where caverns exist that are on this slide in just a minute, but do want you to know that New Jersey has allowed underground caverns to store petroleum products for decades. That's why these two locations exist, but it has no regulations specific to these caverns. At New Jersey's public stakeholder meeting that was held in 2019, there was a lot of industry interest. Since then, industry interest in the development and the marketing of liquefied petroleum products has grown even greater. Gases harvested from gas or oil extraction can be really profitable, and common liquid or liquefied gases are butane, propane, propylene, butylenes. And these are used primarily for fuel, but some can also be used as feedstock in chemical and plastics manufacturing. The cavern storage of these and any petroleum product or derivative is included in this rulemaking, except for liquefied natural gas. So why is there an interest in caverns now? Well, fossil fuel companies are trying to expand gas and oil exports and manufacturing, creating new markets where they can realize a profit selling the glut of fracked gas they can't get rid of and don't have enough storage to hold. Very few states have regulations governing underground storage caverns, and there are no federal regulations. While this rulemaking is way overdue because we already have these 6 caverns you see on this slide in New Jersey, we have to ask the question tonight. Will developing a permitting system to allow underground storage of petroleum products at a time when the industry is hungry for new places to store and market fossil fuels turn New Jersey into a fossil fuel storage hub? We will review the details of the rulemaking, our concerns about them, and explain why Delaware Riverkeeper Network considers it too risky to allow the storage of petroleum in underground caverns in our state, and considers it counter to our climate goals that are supposed to be reducing fossil fuel infrastructure and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I'd like to just quickly look at this slide that you have here and show that the Bayway refinery in Linden has 5 caverns. 2 of them are butane, 3 are propane. It was built many years ago. The same thing with the Gibbstown Logistics Center in Gibbstown, New Jersey. It's the only other cavern location in New Jersey. It holds butane, and it was carved into gneiss, GNEISS, years ago too, decades ago by DuPont, when they stored anhydrous ammonia there for munitions manufacturing. So at this time, I'd like to turn the slideshow over to Kacy Manahan, our attorney. But first, want to just point out that this location here on the left, where you see the 2 stars, one of them is the Linden location and the other is the Gibbstown location. And here's just a picture so you can get like a look at what does it look like what are these underground caverns? So they basically drill them out, they mine them out, and then they put their equipment like a shaft in order to get the product in and out. Here you see workers being lowered down in a elevator down to their work site. Okay, so Kacy, why don't you go ahead and take it away from here? And again, please put your questions in the Q&A box.
Thank you, Tracy. So now that you have an idea of exactly what these storage caverns are, here are some issues that come along with the storage caverns, mainly health and safety issues and environmental issues, which of course they always are interwoven. It's hard to put some of these issues into one box or the other, but for example, the release of a stored substance could cause air quality concerns, which is environmental, but obviously also has immediate or long-term health consequences. Improper storage could result in an explosion or fire. And of course, New Jersey is one of the most, if not the most, densely populated state in the country. So the impact of any type of release or accident could be huge. Also, there are environmental concerns. These caverns, they don't have lining. They're not like a underground tank. It's the product is put directly into the cavern, and the product is exposed directly to the rock and the groundwater that's there in the cavern. And so unless the surrounding rock formation and the groundwater in that rock formation meets very specific conditions, the stored substances can migrate into the groundwater and then eventually into surface water. Also, the construction and operation of these caverns involves greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. And they also pose a risk of long-term contamination due to that lack of the barrier between the regulated substance and the soils and rock. And finally, and most importantly, cavern systems and major industrial operations associated with cavern systems, because they are usually located at very heavy industrial sites that deal in these type of fossil fuels products. They're likely to disproportionately impact environmental justice communities. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Here is some of the rulemaking info that just to give you, why are we talking about this? Because there's a proposed rule that's been published, and we're going to have this slide at the very end so that you can copy down the information. And of course, we'll be distributing this to attendees, but this just gives you an idea of the commenting deadline, how to comment, and how to speak and present oral testimony at the public hearing, which is this Thursday. And if you'd like to speak at the public hearing, it's important to remember you'd want to email this person, Sonia Silcox, by 5 p.m. tomorrow, which to let her know that you'd like to speak at the hearing. So ever since 1951, there's been a law on the books in New Jersey, the statute. It doesn't have a specific name. They refer to it in the rulemaking as quote unquote the Act. And the Act only has 4 sections. It basically says if you want to have an underground cavern for the storage of gas and petroleum products, you need a permit from NJDEP. And the NJDEP, in evaluating that permit, application is supposed to consider the cavern's impact on water quality and quantity, as well as impacts to public health, safety, and welfare. And the Act also gives NJDEP the authority to publish these rules that it's publishing now. Here is just an outline of the subchapters in the new proposed rule to give you an idea of how it flows. There's general provisions like definitions, construction requirements, operating requirements, permitting requirements, how to modify a permit, how to decommission a cavern, what happens when someone violates the rules, and confidentiality of materials that are submitted to DEP. So the good news about the proposed rule is that DEP is proposing to prohibit liquefied natural gas in underground storage caverns. And they said because it's essentially technologically not feasible and it's just too dangerous. As you might know, LNG requires an extremely cold environment. I think it's negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit. So just I think the logistics involved in keeping an underground cavern that cold is not possible. Another good aspect of these rules is that they do not supersede municipal or county ordinances. So that means that community members can advocate locally when there's a proposed cavern system in their area. So they can go directly to their township committee or planning board or and advocate locally for ordinances that would protect them from these caverns. The rule also requires a robust environmental health and impact statement, at least theoretically does. We do have some concerns with the actual text and what they're requiring, but the environmental and health impact statement includes an environmental inventory, an environmental assessment, and a health assessment. The rule also, as Delaware Riverkeeper Network advocated during the stakeholder process, it includes an emergency shutdown valves with leak detection, which can be a great added backstop for safety to make sure that any type of leak is detected as soon as possible and that the cavern system is shut down. Our general concerns, however, are, as Tracy said earlier, the overall risks associated with this type of activity is unacceptable because of our densely populated state, the health risks, the environmental risks, and NJDEP should not be permitting this at all. Another big issue is that the rule does not include a buffer or exclusion zone, so it doesn't really say where you can place these. Not within X number of miles from residences, anything like that. There's really no hard and fast rules about where these caverns can be. It kind of just requires the submission of a lot of information. They also don't include a limitation on cavern expansion, which would, such a limitation would help prevent segmentation, also known as piecemealing, which is a concept in environmental permitting where a project proponent or an applicant comes to the agency with a seemingly small or relatively small project, and then later on keeps adding and adding through modification and expansion until eventually, after several rounds of permits, you have a very large facility. That was not what was presented originally. So a limitation on expansion could prevent that type of activity and force an applicant to be upfront about the size of what they're proposing. The rules don't address the risk of earthquakes, either from a natural earthquake or an earthquake that could be caused by the construction of the cavern or operation of the cavern. They also narrowly address the cavern system, which is defined as just the cavern itself that's underground, and then the equipment above that's up until the first shutdown valve. So they don't really consider beyond that as to what the overall facilities impacts are, what the facility that has the cavern will be doing, and how that will impact the health and safety and environment in the area. And finally, the rules are unclear as to whether they would apply to carbon sequestration. I don't know if you folks have heard about, in the news, they've been talking a lot about carbon pipelines and carbon storage, taking carbon out of the atmosphere to help reverse climate change or prevent the worst outcomes, and then storing it underground. which is a whole different set of concerns that aren't really addressed here. So it's not clear whether that would be permitted under the rules. Here are some, these sections are kind of getting into the nitty gritty. I'm going to skim over them as much as possible, knowing that you'll be able to refer to this on your own time afterwards. But some of the concerns, they're kind of in order of how they appear in the rules. You can see the citations there. And so you can cross-reference with the actual text of the rule itself. The definition of LPG, which is liquid petroleum gas, is very broad. It includes a lot of different substances, and all of these substances have different health and safety impacts. And so the way the rules are written, it would allow a cavern operator to essentially switch out these substances as long as they fall under the umbrella of LPG. Without further department review of their health and safety impacts. Also, the definition of environmental inventory, which you might remember is in that environmental health and impact statement. It was proposed, it seems like it's going to focus on the current status of the environment at the site, which helps, set a baseline. What are the current environmental features at the site? But then when they later on in the rules, when they say, what do you need to put in the environmental inventory, it doesn't really match up with that. It focuses on the proposed project rather than the site as it exists today. And also it lists a couple of things like how does it affect these coastal zone areas, things like that, but they neglected to include special protection waters designated by the Delaware River Basin Commission or Category 1 designated waters under New Jersey's surface water quality regulations, which is a pretty serious oversight given that the Act directs DEP to consider impacts to water quality of these caverns. And again, we said they narrowly focus on the system itself, rather than focusing on the impact of the site overall and how it affects environmental justice communities. How does the daily operation of these caverns affect environmental justice communities, not just in the circumstance where a substance is released or there's some kind of disaster. Also, the climate change impact assessment, which we're going to discuss a little bit more later, focuses only on the effects of climate change on the cavern system, like what's going to happen if there's unusual hurricane and flood. How can the cavern system be protected from harm from these climate impacts? And they're not mandatory either. It just says give us some examples of how you can make your facility more resilient to climate change, but we're not going to require you to do so. And it doesn't focus on the effects that the system itself has on climate change. So, it doesn't answer the question of whether expanding these fossil fuel facilities is in line with our goals or with New Jersey's goals as a state. There's also a third-party evaluation process for the permits where the applicant submits information to a third party who's supposed to be neutral. Because there's some rules in there to prevent them from having too much of an interest that's tied up with the applicant, but still that third party is not a employee of NJDEP, and they are the ones who are doing the evaluation of the materials submitted. Another concern with that is that these third parties, because they're not government entities, they would not be subject to OPRA, which is the Open Public Records Act, and that's how people can get access to information about projects like these cavern systems. The construction of the cavern system involves mining. That doesn't really discuss how the mined materials are to be handled. What if they're radioactive? What if they're contaminated? How are the materials supposed to be handled once you dig out these massive dirt and rock caverns? The existing cavern system owners are currently given 5 years to submit new applications to DEP, and we think that they should be given only 3 years because the 5 years is a little too much time for them to be given, considering that the 5-year cycle of renewal is what they put in these regulations. And then there's some public commenting concerns. First is that the public comment period starts only after DEP has decided to issue the permit. So they have their draft approval ready and they publish that in the bulletin and they say, public, essentially tell us why we're wrong for approving this cavern. So you're already in an adversarial position against DEP. And the period is only 30 days with a 15-day extension. You know, when you compare that, especially to the 3 years and the 5 years that the applicants are given to put together these reports for the cavern systems, it's really hard to imagine how the public can find the help to provide meaningful comment on these highly technical facilities within 30 days or 45 days if DEP is nice and extends the comment period. There's also no comment period at all for an operating permit. So here there's two different permits. There's a construction permit, you know, we want to create a cavern. Then there's a separate process for submitting for an operation permit. So this is how we're going to operate the cavern. And there's absolutely no public commenting period for that. There's also a little bit of confusion about dormancy versus decommissioning. Decommissioning is when essentially you shut down the cavern and say, we're never going to use it again. Dormancy is when you plan on, it says that, the definition that they have is a period during which the regulated substance is withdrawn and is temporarily empty with the intent to inject and store the regulated substance in the future. So it's really, that's kind of vague. It's not clear whether they mean the same substance that was being stored before, how long can it remain empty before you can inject a new substance in there? Could it be decades? Could it be centuries? You know, essentially when should decommissioning be triggered? Yes, relative to that, there's also the question about what if they're going to sell it to a different entity that wants to use a different regulated substance? Is that still dormancy? So there's a lot of questions about how that process would work. The rules also have a provision that allow an owner operator to submit information saying that we should not have to prove that we have $1 million in financial responsibility that's supposed to be in the event of you know, an accident or whether there's a cleanup necessary. So, you know, we just think that's not appropriate, that we think the bare minimum should be 1 million financial responsibility requirement. Finally, there's some issues about confidentiality. This is very common in industrial operations where they need to submit a lot of information to the government so that the government can evaluate their application and say whether you know, the operation is safe or not. But a lot of the information is either sensitive because of trade secrets or patents or things like that, and they just don't want it out there in the world, so they can claim confidentiality. The rules provide a mechanism for applicants to submit such a claim to DEP, and then DEP evaluates the claim, and they may, you know, grant it and say, okay, well, these materials that you gave us we're going to deem them confidential, and if anyone ever submits a Open Public Records Act request to us, we'll withhold them, and the public can't see them. So we think that those claims, you know, the actual claims that are submitted by the applicants should be made available by public record request so that the public can actually evaluate and contest those claims if the information's been improperly withheld and if the information's not truly confidential. There's also some concerns about the mechanical integrity seems to be the focus of these rules, but there's also the concept of chemical integrity, like how will the system potentially affect the chemical composition of the geologic formation, the rock or the soils or the groundwater, and how will those rocks and soils and groundwater potentially affect the substance that's in the cavern. There's also a term in there that's used throughout called the surface footprint, which is kind of a little bit unclear whether they're referring to the area, the above ground area of the cavern where there's the, you know, injection mechanism or withdrawal mechanism, or if they're referring to like if you had a bird's eye X-ray view and you could see down and see how large the cavern is underneath the land. So it's kind of just a little bit of a confusing term that they use there. And then I'm going to turn it back to Tracy to talk a little bit more about climate change and some other issues with the for the proposed rule. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kacy. So I just have a couple slides here wanting to highlight a couple flaws that we see that are really fatal in this rule. One is the requirement that climate change impact assessment be performed. But let's take just a minute to look at what Executive Order 100, which is Governor Murphy's executive order on climate, actually requires. And they refer to Executive Order 100 in the proposed rulemaking. So it says that basically, amongst a lot of other things, that the regulations and policies of the agencies of New Jersey shall govern and reduce emissions of carbon dioxide and also black carbon, hydrofluorocarbons, and methane. The proposed rulemaking, however, doesn't address the requirement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at all. Actually, how does storing greenhouse gas emitting fossil fuels in caverns in New Jersey reduce greenhouse gas emissions? They're assuming that there will be caverns built, but if we have a permitting system that invites in these systems, are we actually going to become a hub that increases this infrastructure? And there are greenhouse gas emissions that go along with that. In fact, greenhouse gas emissions will be added to our atmosphere, digging us further into a hole. And also there's no mention of Executive Order 274. Also, Governor Murphy's executive order, very important order that gets down a little more specifically into what they were going to have to do. I think we missed one slide there. And that is requiring state agencies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030. And they're supposed to employ the Energy Master Plan to do that. They don't even mention it. There's no effort at all to address greenhouse gas emissions or its related pollution, air pollutants. The proposed rule also quotes the Executive Order 100 requirement that Kacy mentioned, which is to look at, how is this rulemaking and the permits that are going to be given out address sea level rise and other climate change considerations. And they're supposed to integrate into their permitting programs a way to do this. However, when you look at the proposed rule, it doesn't address the requirement for resiliency. There's no prohibition, for instance, on caverns in flood hazard areas. It just asks, are you in a flood hazard area? There's no prohibition for putting a cavern in a floodplain or an area subject to sea level rise or storm surge. And there's no other specific measures at all to provide resiliency. All they do is ask for information. And then on top of that, there's a disclaimer that removes any requirement for resiliency, pointing out that it's important to note that the provisions proposed by the applicant don't need to actually be implemented. So it's really a head scratcher how they think this rule is in any way addressing climate change impacts. So on the next slide, I'd like to point out another really important issue that is given short shrift by this rulemaking. It is a disregard for environmental justice impacts. They don't even mention the environmental justice impacts except briefly under social impacts, and they just talk about putting it underground is better than having it on the surface. So what about Executive Order 23? That's Governor Murphy's own executive order. What about Administrative Order 2021-25, which is DEP's administrative order that followed up the executive order for 23 and the environmental justice law, which everybody is heralding as the best in the nation? What about the environmental justice law? So let's just take a brief look at these three things. First, EO 23, Governor Murphy's executive order, the first one he did. It says, amongst a lot of other things, that in order to expand and improve on the past efforts to address overburdened communities, all of the departments of the state should consider environmental justice in implementing their diverse statutory and regulatory responsibilities. They do not do that in this rulemaking. Administrative Order 2021-25. DEP is very proud of this. And yet, when it was put in place, until the rulemaking is promulgated, and it says that because the environmental justice law was established, and that it is important that the agency, as an environmental agency, act on permits, looking at how to avoid adverse cumulative environmental and public health stressors that disproportionately impact overburdened communities. This rulemaking does not address that, period. And that's DEP's own administrative order. And then finally, of course, the enshrined environmental justice law. And yes, the rules have just been put out. They're not promulgated yet. They need to be adopted. But it says, amongst a lot of other things, that the legacy of citing sources of pollution in overburdened communities continues to pose a threat to the health, well-being, and economic success of the state's most vulnerable residents, and that it's past time for the state to correct this historic injustice. The proposed rulemaking includes no consideration for overburdened communities that could be impacted by caverns and the air emissions that are associated with their construction and operations, because there are air emissions of dangerous pollutants. And that is despite looking at the existing locations of where these caverns are located. They're located in or adjacent to identified environmental justice communities. In fact, the Bayway refinery is less than half mile, 0.4 mile, 0.4 of a mile of a, and also is adjacent to low-income minority and limited English census blocks. And Gibbstown is approximately 2 miles from low-income minority census blocks. How are these communities not being overburdened by these caverns? They're not even being looked at, much less consulted with, and their concerns being assessed by the applicant for the permits. So our next, on our next slide here, just briefly going to go over some important, some suggested talking points. And I already put the link in the chat. I'm going to put it in again, and we'll also be sending it out. But we have some suggested talking points because this hearing is coming up very quickly. It's on Thursday morning, and as Kacy said, you have to sign up by 5 o'clock tomorrow night. So this all came on very fast, and we're trying to get everyone up to speed enough that they will feel comfortable to sign up and speak at the hearing. So that's why we made up some suggested talking points and also gave links how you can get a lot more information. But basically, Delaware Riverkeeper Network considers the risks to be too great for New Jersey to permit cavern storage of fossil fuels. It's just simply not acceptable that we would be able to cite in the most densely populated state in the nation, with the highest number of Superfund sites in the nation, with a legacy of environmental contamination, including water, air, and ecosystems, a plethora of an overburdened communities in harm's way, and an urgent need to reduce fossil fuel infrastructure, this fossil fuel infrastructure system. How can we possibly invite in the industry to build caverns when we are facing these limitations and our communities are going to be in harm's way? We just can't do it. It's not acceptable. But we also want to offer very specific fatal flaws in the rulemaking, and Kacy already went over them in detail, but I just want to quickly, so you can think about it for if you want to comment, sign up and comment at Thursday morning's hearing. It's 10 a.m. It sidesteps climate change and environmental justice. There's no exclusion zones or buffers. You don't even know, can they put a road on top of this cavern? Can they build other structures on top of this cavern? We don't even know that. They don't say it. There's no distance or buffer. Other states like Kansas have buffers. You have to be 3 miles from a population center in Kansas. Even New York, which doesn't have very good regulations, they're very inspecific, but they do have a setback of 3,500 feet from populations. But there's also a very overly broad definition of liquefied petroleum gas, and also the other gases, the other petroleum products that can be put into these caverns. There's a very narrow consideration of what's regulated. How are you going to get these products to the cavern? What about the transportation that gets it there? What about the pollution from that? What about the pipelines that get it there? And how are you going to get it out? Is that going to be by truck? Is it going to be by rail? Is it going to be by barge? How are we going to be moving the product in and out? And those need to be considered as part of a cavern, because you build the cavern, then the rest will come. There's also, as Kacy mentioned, it leads to segmentation because there's a lack of limits on expansion. And this bait and switch we've seen too often, even by one of the very applicants who is likely to be the first one in the door because they already have a cavern on their property. There's no upstream or downstream considerations, like I mentioned, that the transportation, the other environmental impacts from mining the gas to start with and getting it and moving it and then marketing it and then burning it in the end. We need to have cradle to grave analysis if we're going to really look at the climate change and pollution impacts from these types of infrastructure facilities. And then there's a lack of specificity in the environmental inventory items. It looks like a lot when you read it, but when you start figuring out, gee, you know, what are the parameters that they would be testing for in water, for instance, when they do the baseline? There's nothing mentioned. It's all very vague. So these are just some quick things here, and we're already at 7:38. So I think, you know, at this point, I think our next slide is really for us to go to questions, right? And I would just, you know, final thing I'd like to say here is that we, you know, the fact that petroleum gases are highly flammable and they can cause explosions or fires, like Kacy said at the top. They release air pollution and they get permits to do that. And because cavern storage poses serious environmental impacts, that is the reason that we need to keep in the front of our mind and not brush it off to the side the way that it's done in this rulemaking. Okay, so let's go to questions. And I see we actually already have a couple in the Q&A. And I'll just read them, and then Kacy, maybe you want to respond to this. This is, the product is not placed directly in the rocks. I can assume it's in specific barrels. The barrels could leak. That is the problem. Well, first I'll say the product is placed directly in the cavern. It's basically they build a straw down and then they build out a big open area, a cavern, mechanically. They mine it and they take the material up and put it on off to the side. And then they fill that rock and soil cavern up with the product. So it's not in barrels. Kacy, would you like to answer anything more on that?
Nope, that's about it. I agree with what you said. Yeah, there's this is for direct storage in the rock. That's why there's in the construction application, they're required to submit a lot of information about what pressure the substance needs to be stored at, and whether, you know, the rock cavern is airtight or not. So it is kind of an unusual, you know, it sounds counterintuitive or it sounds alarming. And I think, you know, because it is putting product directly into the ground and hoping that the rock will just hold it and it won't seep into the groundwater.
So maybe, so this one, why is there a third-party evaluation? What reasoning does DEP give for that? Do you want to take a stab at that, Kacy?
Sure. So they don't really give the reasoning for that. They describe it as, you know, the application materials are submitted to, well, the application materials are created by the applicant, the owner or operator of the cavern. The owner or operator then needs to hire this third party to create an evaluation report, and the third party needs to be knowledgeable about engineering, things like that, geological or geologic systems, and then the evaluation report is submitted together with the application materials to DEP, and the DEP then reviews them together. So I think, you know, you could say maybe it gives DEP, you know, just speculating here, maybe it gives DEP more information that they otherwise wouldn't have. Maybe DEP doesn't have, you know, have the expertise that these third parties might have, but I think that would be built into the review. of both materials. But essentially the problem with this is that even if DEP has a very impartial eye to the evaluation report, there is going to be some communications between the applicant and the third-party evaluator, and we really want to make sure that those communications are not kept from the public eye and kept, if someone wants to request via Oprah, how was this report created, we don't want that to be outside of the reach of the Oprah request.
Right. Okay, so Martin asks, how close is Gibbstown Cavern to the proposed location for the LNG transport facility? It's the same location. The cavern is on the Gibbstown Logistics Center site. That whole facility footprint is just a little bit under 300 acres. And if you look at a map and follow up, I'll get in our email, I'll get a map for you so you can see the site. But there is a cavern that exists on the site that, like I said, was built by DuPont decades ago, was used for many, many decades when they were manufacturing munitions there. And then they have come and built a new dock. And the second dock that they want to build for the export of LNG is not built yet, but it's all right in the same area. So that's why we say we don't even know, what is allowed on top of this cavern. There's, for instance, a huge rail infrastructure project going in there to handle the LNG and other liquefied hazardous gases. Where's that going to be in proximity to this? Where are the ships going to be in proximity to this? What about the transloading system? All of the other infrastructure, there's just every day, I'm exaggerating a little, but it seems that every week there's something new that they're saying they're going to be adding on this site. And so they're really loading it up with a lot of stuff. And yet the Gibbstown Logistics Center owner, Delaware River Partners, has publicly said that they plan to expand, and they're going to be coming in for a cavern expansion or new caverns to DEP with an application. So there's another question here. Who are the parties advocating in favor? Kacy, do you want to give an opinion on that?
Well, I think, the companies that currently have the caverns on site, I think that they definitely want to be involved in this rulemaking because it's going to affect them. So I think primarily the fossil fuel companies who may be interested in expanding or creating storage, exporters who want to export certain fossil fuel liquids. I think that's what I've gathered. I don't know, Tracy, if you want to add any other specific parties.
No, I think it's the oil and gas industry. They're the ones that want this. We know that Delaware River Partners in particular wants to build new caverns and or expand their existing cavern. And there, like I said, at the stakeholder meeting in 2019, there were 2-3 dozen industry representatives there. There was a lot of industry interest in this. So that's why we're afraid, that you set up in a permitting system and you're going to be inviting in the industry. As far as politicians, I see Sean is asking that question. So far, nobody has spoken up. I guess we'll see who puts comments on the record. Another reason to attend the public comment period, specifically the hearing on Thursday. I think, one thing that is really important for the public is let's not assume there isn't going to be a big push from this from powerful people who are representing the special interest of the oil and gas industry in New Jersey. So we need to speak up and say that we don't want this, and we need to speak up for our communities, and our communities need to speak up for themselves. So it is really important for the public. If you can't get it together to speak on Thursday at the hearing, you can still put written comments into the record by July 15th. And so I think, this is really the push here is that no matter who's behind it, we have to be against it. And we have to let the state know that. Okay, see, is cavern storage a must for the LNG? No, there's no LNG storage that is proposed to be prohibited. The LNG terminal is separate from this. It's, as you know, it's proposed, it's not built yet, but the cavern storage is for butane at Gibbstown, and the proposed rulemaking prohibits liquefied natural gas from being stored in underground caverns. And then Martin asks, are the caverns currently empty, or are they currently housing gas? Well, they're all housing product. All of them are in use. The 5 at Bayway and the 1 at Gibbstown. So I see Paul is asking, what would prevent a spark from igniting Bakken crude oil and exploding like a bomb, like in Lac Mégantic? A spark from a machinery that takes the oil down into the cavern. Yes, I mean, there's a lot of concerns that are related because these materials are flammable, they're hazardous, they're potentially explosive, and they can cause unquenchable fires. So it's similar to liquefied natural gas and the dangers that are posed by liquefied petroleum gases and other petroleum gases such as crude oil. As you can see in the definition, it covers all petroleum gases and derivatives. It's very broad. So, you know, if you read the rule, you'll see, I mean, it's 200 pages long and they have a lot in there about the mechanical devices and how you're supposed to have emergency shutoff valves. And I put a link to a paper, it's actually from Europe, but it's very interesting because they examine the accidents, some of the accidents that have happened in the United States. And most of the accidents have occurred just because of what Paula is saying. They've occurred because a valve or an emergency shutoff or notification system did not work, and the product in the cave ignited and it blew up. And the whole, there's some, the link that I gave you has some terrifying explosions of land, not even at the cavern, adjacent to the cavern, a lot bigger area than the cavern is, just exploding. That's why these things, you know, in Kansas have to be kept 3 miles from where anybody lives. But I think, you know, also this danger of a huge explosion is one more insult. It's one more risk, one more threat that we just cannot tolerate here in New Jersey. And I think in order for us to say that, we really need to take a few minutes, all of us, and try to sign up by 5 p.m. tomorrow. It's up there on the screen right now. We're going to follow up with an email, so you'll be able to do that from looking at the email as well, but also the link to the public notice that's up there that is also in the chat. That also will take you to this, telling you where the email to Sonia Silcox is if you can't quickly grab it from the chat. But you can also just copy the chat. I don't know if you've ever done that, but that's what I do when I want to make sure I captured everything, and then just put it into a Word doc right now while we're talking. But I think, and then also July, you know, participating in writing by July 13th is also extremely valuable. It doesn't mean you have to be an expert. None of us are. You know, we're doing what we can in order to bring up the issues that we see and to try to stop New Jersey from becoming an infrastructure hub for the storage of petroleum products in underground caverns. So did I miss any questions in the chat, or does anybody have, oh, somebody had asked about different accidents and problems, and I did put into the chat a paper that has some of them in there, and that is actually, you know, instructive. But there, I also just mentioned, like right across the river in Pennsylvania and Marcus Hook, a very small leak occurred in one of their underground caverns there. They have a huge underground cavern system built a long time ago. And they were storing butane in that cavern, and 5 houses burned down and 30 families were temporarily displaced from a very small leak. And that was back in 1978. But There's been some really horrific catastrophes. There was one in Texas in 1992, and they adopted regulations after that. It doesn't mean that it will prevent that from happening again, but there were 3 people killed, and it caused billions and millions in damage. Cattle and farms were destroyed. So I think, we just need to realize we're playing with fire here when we're inviting the industry to come in and build these caverns and put petroleum underneath our feet. And we will be sending out the links that we already put in the chat. There's a lot more information available too that we have on links to the various environmental justice, administrative and executive orders, the climate change executive orders, and administrative orders, and other sorts of technical information that we'll be sending to you. Okay, well, thank you all very much for joining us tonight. We're at the end of our time, and we want to honor everybody's evening here. And if you have any questions and follow-up, please feel free to get in touch with us. And we're happy to assist in any way to help you prepare for Thursday morning's public hearing or written comment that you want to submit by July 15th. Remember, tomorrow night by 5 p.m., you've got to sign up with DEP if you want to speak on Thursday. Please tell your friends about it too, because this is not a very, well-known rulemaking, and we really want to get the word out there. Okay, thank you all very much. Thanks for attending this evening. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.